set this up. Okay, so who here is actually new to GraphQL? Who has like no idea what it is, or a little bit of an idea maybe? Who has never seen a GraphQL query? Who has never seen a GraphQL query? Okay, so that's already pretty good. All right. Yep. So my talk is about GraphQL schema stitching with Prisma and Contentful. And basically the idea is to combine two APIs, the one from Prisma and the one from Contentful, as it's actually something that we've seen a lot of people do already, to combine these two APIs. But now that Contentful also has a GraphQL API, it's even easier by using the tool of schema stitching. And that's actually what I'm going to talk about. So my name is Nikolas. I'm based here in Berlin, and I work at Prisma. We have launched a couple of months ago, actually, this product Prisma. Before, we had a different product that was called GraphQL, that was more of a backend as a service. And now the new product that we have, Prisma, is kind of the data access layer for GraphQL servers. And this is the agenda for today. So I'm going to start with a quick GraphQL introduction so that we all, again, get on the same page about what it actually is and why you would want to use it. Then I'll quickly talk about GraphQL bindings, which are the tool that I'm using for schema stitching. And then in the end, I'm going to show you how you can do schema stitching with GraphQL bindings. And I have not only one, not two, but I have 3 demos prepared at the end of each section so that you know what these actually look like in practice. So let's start with the introduction and the big question, what is GraphQL? So it basically is a new API standard that was developed and open sourced by Facebook in 2015. And strictly speaking, it is a specification for a type system and a query language. So you can define the types that you want to have in your API. And then GraphQL also gives you a query language to query the data that these types actually define. And there are 3 core primitives that we have in GraphQL: queries, mutations, and subscriptions. Queries are only for reading data. Mutations are for somehow causing side effects in the backend. And subscriptions are for real-time updates when you want to connect to the API, have a steady connection, and whenever an event happens, then the server would submit its updates to the subscribed clients. Why would you want to use GraphQL? So first and foremost, and that's my favorite reason, it has a strongly typed schema for your API. And that has so many advantages in your everyday developer life. If you've used a tool like Swagger, for example, where you also get this contract for your API that you define in YAML, you get somewhat close to the benefits that you get in that area with GraphQL as well. But the way how you actually get that schema with GraphQL and how you can use it and the tooling all around it is just a lot more advanced already than the one with Swagger. Then the really common argument that you always hear, especially from front-end developers, is that you can query exactly the data that you need. So you don't have to hit multiple REST endpoints from your web app anymore to get the data that you're supposed to show on that particular screen. But instead, you can write one query, and that query fetches the data that you need for that screen. And then it has a really rich ecosystem. It provides smooth workflows, and it has a great community around it, which is really noticeable, seeing that it has only been introduced 3 years ago. So what does a GraphQL query actually look like? So most of the GraphQL implementations that you'll find are implemented in that the GraphQL client communicates via post requests with the server, and it puts the GraphQL query into the body of the post request. And here we have a sample GraphQL query that asks for the name and the titles of the posts of a particular user. And the server response that might be returned by the server could look like this, where it's important to note that the JSON object that is returned by the server has exactly the same structure as the query that was submitted by the client. So the client can somewhat define the structure of the JSON object that it's going to receive by submitting that query. So one way to think of a GraphQL query is actually as an empty JSON object that only carries keys but no values, and the server is then going to fill in the values for that empty JSON object. And here I have named 3 reasons why you would want to use GraphQL. In that article, you'll find 5. And if you want to learn a little bit more about the how to get started with GraphQL, I would recommend you to go to howtographql.com and do one of these tutorials there. And we're already getting to the first demo, exploring the Contentful GraphQL API. So I started working with the Contentful GraphQL API yesterday, and it was actually a pretty nice experience to get started with it. Here in the reference documentation, it's explained how you can use GraphQL, which is a tool that you can use to interactively send queries and mutations to a GraphQL API. And that is the URL which you have to put into your browser to get your GraphQL API. Should probably, okay, it's not increasing the browser bar, but anyways. So here I have to replace this space placeholder with the ID of my personal space, which I created in Contentful. So I'm going to copy that over and paste it in here. And then I also have to provide my access token, which right now is okay. I trust all of you. Yeah, exactly. You can't change anything with it. It's just for reading anyways. So I have it here. And now I hit enter. And here is GraphQL. And one advantage that you get from that strongly typed schema that I mentioned at the beginning is that every GraphQL that you're going to use comes with an automatically generated API documentation. So you always know what kind of queries and mutations you have available in your GraphQL API. And in that particular space, I have, and in that particular case, I have one GraphQL space here, or one Contentful space with one content model. And that content model only has 3 fields, a title, a text, and this Prisma author ID that we're going to talk about later. And we currently have 2 of these articles stored in the Contentful space. So now if I want to explore the kinds of queries that I can send to my Contentful GraphQL API, is I can check the documentation right here, and I see I have this article collection query. So the way how I can use it is just by typing that out. And we also get this really nice auto-completion feature here. And now I can ask for all the articles in my Contentful space. And here I can, for example, ask for the ID of each item, and then I can also ask for the values of the fields. So for example, for the title and the text. And I've hit the play button now. Here is the response from the server, and that's exactly what we expected, in that here I defined the shape of the response object, and we get exactly that. We get this article collection, items, sys, ID, fields, title, text, and this is exactly the shape that I defined here in my query. So now I would like to use the second query that I have available here to ask for one single article. So ideally, it would be possible to just use a new tab here. So I can do that in my browser. But actually, what I want to show you now is a tool that is a little bit better or has more features than GraphQL. And that's a GraphQL playground. It's built on top of GraphQL. And it basically looks very similar, but you can also use it as a standalone application on your Mac. It also has this schema documentation here on the right, and it works in exactly the same way as GraphQL. So in the next parts, I'll only use the GraphQL playground instead of GraphQL. And you see it works in exactly the same way. It has a couple of advantages. For example, you can specify your HTTP headers here, and we'll also see what kind of use we can make of the site nav. So let's quickly try that query to retrieve a single article as well. So I'm providing the ID of one particular article. Again, retrieving some data and also retrieving the title and the text of all of them. And now I just get one item back, the one with that particular ID. All right. That's it for the first part of the demo, and that's how the GraphQL API from Contentful works. So at the moment, the Contentful GraphQL API is only available for the content delivery API, so you can only read data, you can only send queries. Maybe it's planned in the future to also support the content management API with mutations, but maybe we hear a bit more in the second talk, or maybe not, I don't know. All right. So next I want to talk about GraphQL bindings, which are the tool that I'm going to use for schema stitching. So GraphQL bindings basically are schema specifics and typed GraphQL clients that allow you to send queries and mutations to a GraphQL API by invoking dedicated functions in your programming language. So just like GraphQL, GraphQL bindings are not bound to one particular language. You can write your GraphQL server in JavaScript, in Java, in Python, in Ruby. It's not bound to a particular language. And in the same way, GraphQL bindings are also not bound to a particular language. And you can somewhat think of GraphQL bindings as an automatically generated SDK for a specific GraphQL API. So what does that mean? Let us quickly think about what an SDK actually is. So here we have like some API, for example, the Contentful API, or if you've worked with Firebase before, like here we have some web API that we can talk to via HTTP that exposes a couple of endpoints, and we have to hit these endpoints to get our data. So basically what we want is we don't want to construct an HTTP request every time we need something from the API. We don't want to have that kind of boilerplate code that we would have to repeat for all the different requests that we want to make. Instead, we want to use some kind of object that exposes functions that lets us talk to the API directly and that makes the API access in general more convenient. And that's what we're using SDKs for. So if you've built a JavaScript app with Node, for example, that is talking to the Contentful API, you probably didn't use fetch to actually interact with the API, but you rather use the Contentful SDKs and used the methods that were exposed through that SDK to talk to that API. And in the same way, you can think of GraphQL bindings as being automatically generated SDKs for a particular GraphQL API. And in fact, I'm going to show you how you can use bindings to talk to the GraphQL API that I just showed in the playground. So here we go. Let's go into the second demo. So here I've prepared 3 steps. In the first step, we're going to talk to the Contentful GraphQL API just with fetch. In the second step, we're going to use a Contentful binding object to talk to the API. And then in the third one, I'm going to actually create one more function on that binding object that also allows me to create new articles. So it goes beyond the capabilities of the actual GraphQL API. So what do we have here in that very simple Node script? And to quickly give you an idea of how simple this app actually is, we really only have one dependency, which is fetch. And here, this is basically all the data for my Contentful space. So again, I have my space ID, the access token, and the locale. And here I'm using all of that information to build up the endpoint for my API, which I'm then using here in fetch to send an HTTP request to it. And here I have already this variable that is called query, where I'm now just going to paste in the query that I sent previously in the playground. So here, this is the same GraphQL query that we previously sent to the Contentful API through the playground. Now I'm sending it in a Node script using fetch. And then I'm logging the result right here. So let's go ahead and run this. And we see this here. We can quickly format this. And this is pretty much exactly the same data that we saw in the playground here. So article sysID fields text title with exactly the same values. So that seems to work. So next I want to show you how you can use a GraphQL binding to talk to this API. So this one is a little bit more complicated. We have a few more dependencies. So here still is node fetch. Then we're using GraphQL tools, GraphQL binding, GraphQL. Contentful management, we actually don't need yet. We'll need that in the next one. And then Apollo link HTTP. So these are the dependencies that we're using now. But so from that dependency setup, it seems like it would be a lot more complicated, which it's not. So actually the script itself, here is only a couple of lines, but this Contentful binding class is the interesting part of it. So let's take a look at that one. Again, I have all the data for my Contentful endpoint. I'm building the endpoint in the constructor of my binding. I'm using the endpoint to create this HTTP link from the Apollo link HTTP package, where my access token is already included. And then I'm calling this make remote executable schema here. And this class also extends binding. And this is all I need to do in order to get started with GraphQL bindings for my own GraphQL API. So you could do this with like basically all or with any GraphQL API you like to just inside the constructor of the binding object, just create this HTTP link, create this remote executable schema, and pass it to the super constructor of the binding, and then you have the binding. So now what can you use that binding for? So I have mentioned in the beginning that the GraphQL bindings basically allow you to send queries and mutations to a GraphQL API by invoking functions. So this binding object now exposes the GraphQL queries that I have in my in the GraphQL schema of my Contentful API as functions. So this function here, which is called article, corresponds. It's basically is the same as this GraphQL query. It will construct this article query under the hood. So it also needs this ID argument, which I'm providing here. So here we can grab the same ID and provide it. And then we have this selection set. So because this function, this article function, constructs an entire GraphQL query and sends it over to the GraphQL API, it needs to know what fields I'm actually requesting. So here I can go ahead and specify the selection set of the query, and the selection set is really only that part. So it's the fields that I'm requesting in my query is called the selection set. So I'm copying all the fields, oops, and paste it in there. I have one too many, yeah. All right, so now if I run this, we kind of expect the same result that we saw before with Node, with plain fetch. And indeed, we have the same object that is being returned. And we already got rid of the root field data here and only have the actual payload of the response. All right, so in the next step, I want to go one step further and show you, let's do that. How you can now extend your binding to add more custom functionality. And in this case, here I would like to use the binding also to create new articles. And the way how that works is basically I just define a new function, a new method on my Contentful binding class, where I'm instantiating this Contentful client, which I now import from the Contentful management SDK, which allows me to make changes to the data in my Contentful space. And basically, I'm using it to just create this new article right here with the data that was provided. And then I'm returning basically the new article here. In the index.js class, in the index.js file, I call the create article class, which returns a promise. And then in the handler of the promise, I ask for that same article, which I just created with the article query. So if I run this, we kind of expect that we first create this new article. So we'll see this success message here. And then we'll use the ID that was returned by that creation call to send this query here and retrieve the same article again. So again, we need a selection set. Let's copy it again. So let's see if it works. Yes, and for some reason, or apparently I'm using a deprecated way of creating the new article, but I still went with it. So we first created and published the new article, and then we retrieved the same article using the article query. All right, perfect. So that was it for the second part of the demo. Let's now talk about the idea of schema stitching with GraphQL bindings. So in general, schema stitching refers to the act of composing multiple GraphQL APIs into a single one. Who of you is a front-end developer and has had experience with React? All right, quite a few people. The deal with React is that you're able to compose your components and build up bigger, more powerful components out of smaller ones. And you can kind of think of GraphQL APIs in the same way, that you're using multiple GraphQL APIs to build up bigger ones. And there are two basic approaches to how schema stitching can be done. Either you're merging schemas or you pick and choose. So when you merge schemas, you really take two GraphQL schemas, you take the union of them, and you have your new GraphQL schema that exposes everything that was available before. Or this pick and choose approach that I'm using, where we are using GraphQL bindings to pick and choose the kind of operations that we want to expose in our new API. And it uses the idea of schema delegation under the hood, which basically means that this layer, this schema stitching layer that puts together our two GraphQL APIs, so it's not the instance that is actually going to resolve the queries, but it only forwards the queries to the actual APIs. So I'm using these two tools to do that. Prisma, which basically is a tool that turns your database into a GraphQL API and makes it easy for you to build GraphQL servers. You can somewhat think of it as your data access layer, something like an object relational mapper that you use to glue together your server and your database, so that you don't have to write like any SQL or something like that, but you get a nice abstraction for how you can work and retrieve, or how you can work with your database and read and write data from it. And the goal of Prisma really is for you to make it easy to build complex applications. And then on the other hand, we have Contentful, which is a headless content management system where the API that is exposed is directly consumed by the client applications. So here's a big difference between Prisma and Contentful. Prisma also provides you with an automatically generated GraphQL API for your database. But for Prisma, your client applications would never talk to Prisma's GraphQL API directly, because most of the time you want to have additional business logic, or you want to have integrations with other, with other services. In these kinds of situations, you want to control your own API, and you want to put that additional server layer on top of that. With Contentful, where it's all about content management and making content management easy for content creators and for developers, there we have kind of not the same goal, which is why these two tools go really well together, actually. And here is basically the idea that I want to show now, is that I add one more user type to my application, and the user data is going to be stored in my Prisma database. So I can access user data through the Prisma API. And then I have this still the content API from Contentful, where I'm storing all my articles. And this will basically make it possible for my client applications to send one query to this GraphQL server here, and the GraphQL server takes care of resolving the data from these two different sources. So here comes the third demo. All right, so this project again is a little bit bigger than before. So let's start with the things that we already know. I have this Contentful binding class right here, which is exactly the same that we saw at the end of the second demo. And the index file now is basically a file that is starting a GraphQL server where I'm implementing resolvers, and then using these resolvers to start my GraphQL server. And the schema for the GraphQL API is defined in schema.graphql. So let's take a look at the schema and the operations that it exposes. So this is what my schema looks like. I can send a user query to retrieve one single user to this GraphQL server, and how it's going to be resolved is that the data needs to be fetched from Prisma. I can send this article query to the GraphQL server, and this actually accesses Contentful and Prisma, because as you will see, this article type that is returned by the query has this Prisma author field, and this is a user type. And this user type comes from the Prisma schema. So I'm connecting these two schemas by defining this article type right here. And then we can also use mutations. So I can send a create user mutation to create a new user in the Prisma database, and create article for user mutation, where I can create a new article in my Contentful space, and at the same time associated with a user in my Prisma database. I quickly want to show you how Prisma is configured and set up. So here is my configuration for my Prisma API in this Prisma folder. I have the Prisma YAML file, which shows me the endpoint of my Prisma API, and also points to my data model. This data model.graphql file contains the definition of my data model. And the data model will be taken by Prisma and converted into an actual database schema. So one core advantage that you also get when you're using Prisma to optimize your database workflows is that Prisma is also taking care of database migrations for you. You don't have to write SQL statements anymore to define your database schema. Instead, you're writing GraphQL schema definition language, the SDL, which is really simple and concise to define your schema, and Prisma is going to translate it into an according database schema. And the last thing that I want to show you before I actually show you the demo is this GraphQL config file here that is used by several GraphQL tools, such as the GraphQL CLI, but also by the GraphQL Playground. And here I'm defining 3 different projects. One that is called app, one that is called CF for Contentful, and then this Prisma project right here. And this basically allows me to work with all of these GraphQL APIs side by side inside a GraphQL Playground. So I first need to start the actual server. And now when I run the GraphQL Playground command, we see that in the left, here in the left side nav, we actually have these 3 projects available, and we can send queries and mutations to all of them just by switching here in the side nav. And it's all based on this GraphQL config file that is used by the GraphQL Playground for exactly that purpose. So here, this is the Contentful API that we already saw before. So I can basically send the same kind of queries, which I previously sent only to the GraphQL API, to the Contentful API here in the Playground again, and we get the same data. This is the Prisma API, which is a mirror to my database. So it provides really generic and powerful CRUD operations to work with my data. So I can also retrieve, for example, all the users here. We currently have 1 user in the database. Yeah, so now we can go ahead and check what the operations of our actual GraphQL server that uses the schema stitching that is talking to both of these APIs actually looks like. So these are the queries and mutations that I have defined in the GraphQL schema. User, article, create user, and create article for user are the same queries and mutations which we see here: user, article, create article for user. So the auto-generated documentation is always based on this GraphQL schema here. So let's go ahead and start with a simple user query. Let me quickly grab Carl's ID here again. All right, so we see that in our GraphQL server that is doing the schema stitching, we can talk to the Prisma API. Let's now go ahead and try the article query to ask for a single article. And here I have my own flat structure. And I can expand that expand the flat structure with information about the Prisma author. And here we now hit both GraphQL APIs with a single query. All right. That's it for the technical part. Before I let you go, I quickly want to talk to you about GraphQL Europe, which is happening on Friday, which is the biggest GraphQL conference in Europe that we are hosting as Prisma. We'll have speakers from companies like Facebook, GitHub, Twitter, Docker, Shopify, Medium, Coursera. So really all the top companies that are using GraphQL in production today. And also 2 of the very creators of GraphQL, Nick Schrock and Lee Byron, who created GraphQL during their time at Facebook. That's it. Thank you. Any questions?
Test, test. Hi. Yeah, thank you. It was really amazing. My question is about bindings and bindings versus GraphQL clients, basically. So what I heard is, I haven't used GraphQL in production or anything like that, but I heard that clients give you really some nice optimization features around, like with caching and deciding on what queries to send to the API and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And if you now promote this idea of using bindings instead of clients, what's the trade-off there?
So these have 2 different use cases, basically. So the GraphQL clients that you are basically referring to, probably things like Apollo client or Relay or Graphu is the latest one that was introduced last week, I think, or Urkel. So these GraphQL clients are typically used on the front end when you're building a web app, where you need things like caching, and maybe you don't want to build your own custom cache or optimistic UI updates. And that's where you would typically use those GraphQL clients. GraphQL bindings, on the other hand, they don't give you any more functionality than these automatically generated functions to send the queries and mutations. So their use case is actually more on the server side, usually, for example, for service-to-service communication. So what we're investigating at the moment is how, for example, GraphQL bindings could be a replacement for gRPC. And we're talking to a lot of companies that are using gRPC today that are looking now into bindings and how they could use bindings for service-to-service communication. So they kind of don't have exactly the same use case. Maybe for really simple front-end application where you don't necessarily need all these additional features, there it might also make sense to use GraphQL bindings. But yeah, so while the GraphQL clients like Apollo and Relay are usually focused on the front end and are integrating with your view layers. GraphQL bindings are typically more used on the server side. Any more questions? If not, then at least I need to mention that I have a couple of Prisma stickers with me, so feel free to grab them. And yeah, thanks again.